Welcome to Jolene's Stories, where a woman who gave everything finally reclaims it.
My name is Norma Reed. I'm 52 years old. On a Tuesday morning last October, I stood in the doorway of a federal courtroom in Richmond, Virginia, holding a flash drive no bigger than my thumb. On that drive were 19 months of falsified billing records, every one of them bearing my husband's signature, every one of them documenting fraud he believed no living person had traced. His attorney was already on his feet requesting a recess. The judge denied it before the man finished his sentence. Richard looked at me from the defense table, and for the first time in 27 years of marriage, he had nothing to say. What I'm about to tell you is how a woman with a limp, a dead mother, and a pair of reading glasses dismantled the man who tried to have her declared insane. Before I walk you through the worst year of my life, I want to say something. If you're listening to this on our channel for the first time, welcome. This is where people tell the stories they survived. Real stories about trust that turned out to be theater and the moment the theater came down. If this one stays with you, hit subscribe and leave a comment. I read them. They matter. Now, to understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when I still believed the man sleeping next to me was my partner. Richard and I met in 1996 at a continuing education seminar in Arlington. He was finishing his Series 65, working toward becoming a licensed investment advisor. I was 2 years into my career as a forensic auditor at a mid-size accounting firm in Richmond, the kind of firm where you spend your days following decimal points through layers of paperwork until you find the number someone hoped you wouldn't. I was good at it. I am still good at it. Richard, at that seminar, was charming in the way that specific breed of financial men can be. The ones who memorize your coffee order on the first date and remember your mother's birthday before you remind them. He had warm hands and a quick laugh and a way of making you feel like every room improved the moment you entered it. We married 14 months later in a small ceremony at St. Stephen's Episcopal in Richmond. I wore my mother's pearl earrings. Richard cried during the vows. I believed every tear. The first decade was what I thought marriages were supposed to be. We bought a house in Henrico County, a brick colonial with a screened porch, and a yard big enough for the dog we never got around to adopting. Richard built his wealth management practice from a single desk in a shared office to a firm managing portfolios for retirees, small business owners, families who trusted him with everything they'd saved. I climbed at my firm, senior associate, then manager, then senior forensic auditor, the person they called when the numbers didn't add up and someone needed to explain why to a courtroom. We had Sloane in 1999, a girl with Richard's jawline and my stubbornness. I used to joke that she got the best parts of both of us. I believed that too. The second decade was harder in the ways that second decades are. Richard traveled more. Conferences, client dinners, networking events in cities I'd never been invited to. I carried the house, carried Sloane's school logistics, carried the grocery runs and the furnace repairs and the slow accumulation of responsibilities that one person absorbs when the other person is always somewhere else. But I told myself this was partnership. Unequal weight distributed across unequal strengths. He earned. I organized. He expanded. I maintained. I didn't resent it. I was too tired to resent it. Then my mother got sick. Pancreatic. The diagnosis came in February, and she was gone by September. I spent those 7 months driving to her apartment in Petersburg 3 times a week, sitting beside her hospital bed, managing her medications, arguing with insurance companies using the same voice I used to argue with opposing counsel over discrepancies in ledgers. Richard was supposed to come with me to her last lucid weekend. He had a conference in Scottsdale. He kissed my forehead at the door, told me to give her his love, and drove to the airport. My mother died on a Thursday. I was holding her hand. Richard was in Arizona. Or so I believed. The The limp came from a car accident 3 years before any of this, a rear-end collision on I-64 that fractured my left ankle in 2 places. The orthopedist said I healed well. The limp stayed, slight but permanent, a half-second delay in my left step that I compensated for with deliberate precision. I didn't think about it much, but I learned later that Richard thought about it constantly. He'd been telling friends, colleagues, anyone who'd listen, that my limp was getting worse, that I was declining, that he was worried about me. He said it with the concerned furrow of a devoted husband. He said it so often that people started seeing deterioration that wasn't there. The limp was a prop in a story Richard was writing about me, and I didn't know I was a character in it. The first anomaly came disguised as paperwork. In January, 8 months before the courtroom, I noticed my direct deposit pay stub looked different. The routing number had changed. My paycheck, the one I'd been depositing into my personal account for 22 years, was now going into a joint account I barely used. I asked Richard. He didn't hesitate. He said the bank required consolidation, something about new federal compliance rules. He produced a letter. It was on the bank's letterhead. It had a signature I didn't recognize, and language that sounded official enough to satisfy a question asked at 7 in the morning over coffee. I folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer where we kept important papers. I went to work. I audited 3 client files that day, and in every one of them, I would have caught a forged letter in under 4 minutes. But this was my husband. This was my kitchen. I wasn't auditing. I was trusting. 3 weeks later, Sloan called. She was 26, living in Arlington, working in marketing for a defense contractor. We talked every Sunday, the kind of comfortable weekly ritual that fills the space between visits. But this call was a Wednesday, and the questions were wrong. She asked me what I'd had for breakfast. She asked me if I remembered our neighbor's name. She asked me what year I was born. I laughed and told her I wasn't taking a quiz. She laughed too, but it was the wrong laugh, tight and rehearsed. The laugh of someone completing an assignment. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and replayed the conversation. Every question she'd asked me was a cognitive screening question. I knew because I'd seen them before, in medical intake forms, in competency evaluations attached to financial fraud cases. My daughter was assessing me, and someone had given her the script. I started watching. Not investigating, not yet, just watching. The way you watch a number that doesn't quite balance, the thing that's probably rounding error but might not be. Richard came home later than usual 3 nights in a row. His explanations were smooth: client dinners, a networking event at the Jefferson Hotel, a late meeting with Peter Ashford, his colleague at the firm. Each explanation was plausible. None of them were verifiable. I didn't verify, but I noticed. Then Peter Ashford stopped speaking to me. We'd been neighborhood acquaintances for years. Our houses were 4 doors apart. At the Henrico County Neighborhood Block Party in March, Peter saw me approaching and turned his body 45 degrees, angling toward a conversation he hadn't been part of, giving me his shoulder with the practiced ease of a man avoiding something contagious. His wife, Ellen, smiled at me from across the folding table, but it was the smile you give someone you've been warned about. Sympathetic. Careful. The smile of someone managing a situation. I stood alone with a paper plate of potato salad and understood, without yet having the words for it, that a story was being told about me to people I'd known for a decade, and I was not the one telling it. My body knew before I did. Sleep went first. I'd lie beside Richard in the dark and feel my jaw clenched so tight my molars ached by morning. Then appetite. I'd sit across from him at dinner and feel my throat close around food I'd cooked myself. I lost 4 pounds in 2 weeks without trying. My hands developed a tremor, barely visible, just enough to make my signature look different, which I realized later was exactly the kind of detail Richard could point to. See? She's shaking. She's not well. My own stress was generating the evidence he needed. The first real discovery happened on a Saturday in April. Richard was at his office, or said he was. I was cleaning the car, his car, because mine was in the shop, and I'd borrowed his sedan to drive to the pharmacy. The glove box stuck when I opened it. I pulled harder. It released, and a phone slid forward against the latch. Not his phone. His phone was the silver iPhone he carried everywhere, the one with the cracked case he never replaced. This phone was black. No case. Warm from the sun through the windshield. The screen lit when I touched it. No passcode. 14 months of messages with a woman named Diane. I sat in the driver's seat of his car in our driveway, with the engine off and the windows up, and read 6 months of those messages in 11 minutes. My hands were so cold I could barely scroll. Diane referenced our place in Charlottesville. She referenced weekends Richard told me were conferences. She referenced money, transfers, accounts, the casual financial vocabulary of someone who understood exactly where the funds were coming from. One message from February read, "The Scottsdale thing worked. She didn't suspect anything." Scottsdale, the conference that didn't exist. The week my mother was dying. The week I was holding her hand alone. I put the phone back. I closed the glove box. I went inside, washed my hands, put on my reading glasses, the tortoiseshell frames I've worn for 11 years, the ones I use to read every spreadsheet and every fraudulent billing record that crosses my desk, and I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I did not cry. I want you to understand that. I did not cry. Something in me shifted from wife to auditor. I don't know the exact second it happened, but I know what it felt like. It felt like putting on armor made of numbers. I found the Charlottesville condo first. It was registered to an LLC called Ashland Capital Group. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize, but the filing address was a P.O. box in Norfolk. I traced the LLC's formation documents through the Virginia State Corporation Commission's online database. The organizer listed was a practicing attorney in Norfolk named Gerald Tate. Gerald Tate was Richard's college roommate. The same Gerald Tate who had, as I would soon discover, notarized a quitclaim deed removing my name from our Henrico County home using a signature I never made. I called in sick to work on Monday. I told Richard I had a migraine. He brought me tea and kissed my forehead, the same gesture, and told me to rest. I spent 8 hours at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, following money. This is what I do for a living. This is what I have done 5 days a week for 22 years. I have traced embezzlement through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I have reconstructed destroyed ledgers from bank metadata. I have sat across from CFOs who thought they were smarter than the numbers and watched them realize they were not. Richard thought he was smarter than me. Richard managed retirement portfolios for elderly clients. I dismantle the people who steal from elderly clients. By Tuesday evening, I had the first layer. Richard's firm managed approximately $40 million in client assets across several dozen accounts. Over the past 19 months, management fees had been systematically inflated by between 12 and 18 basis points per account, invisible to any client reviewing their quarterly statement, but compounding to approximately $2.3 million siphoned into accounts Richard controlled. The Charlottesville condo was purchased for $380,000 through Ashland Capital Group, and that was just Charlottesville. By Wednesday, I found 3 more properties. 1 in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1 in Savannah, 1 outside Nashville, all purchased through different LLCs, all funded by skimmed fees, all tied through layers of paperwork a less experienced auditor might have missed to Richard Andrew Reed. I want to pause here, because what I felt sitting at that table was not what you might expect. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was the sickening, vertiginous clarity of a woman who has just realized that the last 27 years of her life were a set, a stage, a constructed environment designed to keep her compliant and blind, while the man she married built an entirely separate existence with her money, her client's money, and her trust as the foundation for all of it. Every anniversary dinner, every forehead kiss, every conference that wasn't a conference, every time he told Sloan to call and check on me, not because he was worried, but because he was building a medical narrative. The cognitive decline story, the limp, the shaking hands. I wasn't his wife. I was his cover. I called my friend Marguerite Faison. We'd worked together at the firm for 15 years before she moved to a compliance role at a bank in Northern Virginia. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting for 45 minutes. Then she said something that probably saved my life, or at least saved my case. She said, "Norma, do not confront him. Not yet. Not until you have everything. He's been building this for years. You need to build yours in weeks. And yours needs to be perfect." She was right. She was completely right. And for the next 7 months, that is exactly what I did. I filed with the IRS whistleblower office in May. A sealed submission. I documented every irregularity, every skimmed fee, every fabricated performance report, every unauthorized transfer. I cross-referenced client statements with actual market returns and showed the systematic inflation. I provided account numbers, dates, amounts. $2.3 million across 19 months. The IRS assigned a case number. They didn't contact Richard. They didn't contact the firm. They began their own parallel investigation, and I went home every evening and sat across the dinner table from a man who had no idea that the woman he was trying to have declared incompetent had already handed the federal government the evidence that would end his career. This is where the masquerade began. If you have never had to sit across from someone who has betrayed you in ways you are still cataloging and pretend that you trust them, let me tell you what it costs. It costs your sleep first, then your appetite, though I'd already lost that. Then it costs a layer of something I don't have a clinical name for, a layer between your skin and the world that used to be trust and is now just performance. You smile. Your face knows how to smile. You laugh at the right moments. Your voice knows where the laughter goes. But behind the smile and the laugh, there is a woman doing math. Always doing math. Calculating how many days until the hearing. Calculating how many more dinners she has to eat with this man. Calculating how many more forehead kisses she can receive without screaming. Richard brought me flowers the 3rd week of September. Yellow roses. He set them on the counter and told Sloan on the phone, "See, I'm trying. I love your mother. I just want what's best for her." I heard him say it from the hallway. I was standing there with my reading glasses in my hand, the same glasses I'd used that morning to review the latest IRS correspondence confirming the scope of their investigation. He hung up and smiled at me with a warmth that would have dissolved me 6 months ago. Now it just made my throat tighten. Not from grief, from the effort of not telling him that I knew. That kiss was a lock, not a gesture. There were specific moments I almost broke. The worst was a Thursday in September. Richard and I were eating dinner. Grilled chicken, steamed broccoli, the kind of unremarkable meal that fills a weeknight. He was telling me about his day, a client meeting, a portfolio rebalance, completely routine language. And I knew because I had the records, that the client he was describing, a 74-year-old retired school teacher named Dorothy Kendall, had been overcharged $6,800 in management fees that quarter. He was telling me about helping her as though the help were real. I cut a piece of chicken. I chewed. I swallowed. It had no taste. My body was running on adrenaline and disgust. I said, "That sounds like it went well." He said, "She trusts me completely." I set my fork down very carefully so he wouldn't see my hands shake. Another moment, a Saturday afternoon. Richard was in the shower. His regular phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it, but the notification was visible from where I stood folding laundry. A text from Diane. 2 words and a heart emoji. I folded the next shirt. I folded the shirt after that. I heard the water shut off. I heard him whistling. He came out in a towel, picked up his phone, glanced at the screen, and put it face down on the dresser without changing expression. I said, "Anything important?" He said, "Just Peter about golf." I said, "Have fun." I matched his socks and put them in his drawer, the same drawer where I'd found the second phone, and I did not flinch. The almost caught moment happened 8 days before the conservatorship hearing. Richard came home unexpectedly while I was at the kitchen table with my work laptop open. On the screen was an IRS form, not a client file, my file, the whistleblower correspondence. He walked into the kitchen and his eyes went to the screen. I felt my entire circulatory system redirect blood from my extremities. He said, "Working late?" I closed the laptop halfway and said, "Just a client file, same old billing discrepancies." He stood there for a beat too long. His eyes stayed on the laptop. Then he said, "You work too hard." He poured himself bourbon and went to the den. I sat at the table for 10 minutes without moving, my left hand flat on the laptop lid, feeling my heartbeat in my fingertips. If he'd seen the form number, if he'd read the header, 9 days. I needed 9 more days. Marguerite talked me down that night on the phone. I was in my car in the Walgreens parking lot on Parham Road because it was the only place I could speak freely. I told her I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit across from him for 9 more days. She said, "Norma, you've been doing this for months. 9 more days is the difference between a clean case and a mess. Your evidence is airtight. Don't give him time to destroy anything." I gripped the steering wheel and breathed. She was right. She was always right. 9 days. Then Richard scheduled the intervention. This is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I tell it. 5 days before the conservatorship hearing, Richard told me that some family was coming over for dinner. Sloan drove down from Arlington. Richard's brother, Craig, came from Virginia Beach. And at the door, a woman I'd never met introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Voss, a licensed clinical psychologist. Richard guided everyone into the living room with the careful choreography of a man who'd planned every seat, every sightline, every word. He sat me in the wing chair by the window, the chair with the lowest seat, the one that makes you look up at everyone else in the room. He thought about that. He thought about all of it. Sloan was crying before anyone spoke. Craig looked uncomfortable. Richard delivered a speech about love and concern and wanting the best for me that was so polished it could have been focus grouped. Then Dr. Voss opened a file and began reading from what she called a preliminary psychological evaluation. She read symptoms I didn't have. She cited behaviors I'd never exhibited. She referenced a pattern of cognitive decline that she attributed to interviews and observations she'd supposedly conducted over multiple sessions. I had never met this woman before that evening. I had never spoken to her. I had never been in her office. The evaluation was pre-written. And here is the moment that changed everything, the moment that separated the masquerade from the confrontation. Dr. Voss read a billing code from the evaluation. It was a CPT code, the kind of numerical identifier attached to every psychological service billed to insurance or entered as a legal document. I was wearing my reading glasses. I looked at the number, and my 22-year career as a forensic auditor recognized it before my conscious mind formed the thought. The billing code was formatted incorrectly. Not wrong, formatted. It used a structure I'd seen exactly twice before, both times in cases where evaluations had been fabricated for legal proceedings. The code was real, but the formatting convention was one used by document preparation services, not clinical practices. This evaluation had been written to specification. It was a product. Richard had ordered it the way you order a custom suit. I looked at Dr. Voss over the top of my glasses. She looked back at me, and I saw something in her face that I did not expect. I saw doubt. I said nothing. I let the intervention play out. I let Richard hold my hand and tell me he loved me and wanted to help me. I let Sloan hug me and whisper that everything was going to be okay. I let Craig pat my shoulder. I let Dr. Voss close her file. And when everyone left, I went upstairs, locked the bathroom door, sat on the edge of the tub, and pressed a cold washcloth to my face until my breathing was steady enough to think. What I didn't know then was that Dr. Voss went home that night and couldn't sleep either. She'd accepted an $8,000 retainer from Richard to produce the evaluation. She'd been given intake questions, symptom descriptions, and a pre-written conclusion. She'd agreed because the money was good, and the work seemed straightforward. But sitting in my living room, watching my face while she read fabricated symptoms to a woman whose eyes were clear and focused and furious behind tortoiseshell glasses, something in her broke open. She told me later it was the glasses. She said I looked at her the way an auditor looks at a ledger that doesn't balance, and she realized in that moment that she was the entry that didn't balance. 3 days before the hearing, Dr. Voss appeared at my kitchen door. I had never given her my address. She'd gotten it from Richard's file. She carried a manila folder. She set it on my kitchen table and said, "Your husband hired me to write your psychological evaluation. I couldn't do it. Here's everything he asked me to fabricate." The folder contained Richard's instructions, his emails, the intake questions he'd drafted, the pre-written conclusion he wanted her to sign, and copies of the $8,000 retainer payment. My hands were shaking when I opened it. My reading glasses were on. I read every page. Dr. Voss sat across from me and did not speak until I looked up. Then she said, "I'll testify. Whatever you need." I said, "I need you to tell the truth." She said, "That's why I'm here. 9 days." That's how long I had between learning about the conservatorship petition and standing in a courtroom. Richard had filed an emergency petition for conservatorship over my finances. He cited the fabricated psychological evaluation. He cited the cognitive decline narrative he'd constructed with Sloan over months of scripted phone calls. He cited a forged letter from a physician I had never visited, a Dr. Alan Mercer in Short Pump, whose signature I later confirmed was copied from a prescription pad Richard had taken from the office during a routine visit for his own blood pressure. Every piece of evidence Richard submitted to justify taking control of my life was something he had manufactured. And every piece of evidence I was about to submit to stop him was something I had found by doing the only thing I've ever been truly great at: following the numbers. I contacted an attorney on a Tuesday, Elaine Cho, a family law attorney in Richmond with a secondary practice in financial fraud litigation. Marguerite recommended her. Elaine listened to my story for 2 hours in her office on Main Street. She reviewed the IRS whistleblower submission, the parallel audit file, Dr. Voss's folder, the forged quitclaim deed, the bank consolidation letter, the billing records. She was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then she said, "Norma, this isn't a conservatorship case. This is a criminal case, and you've already won it. He just doesn't know yet." The night before the hearing, Richard brought me tea. Chamomile. He set it on my nightstand the way he'd done 1,000 times. He said, "Tomorrow's going to be hard, but I'll be right there with you. We'll get through this together." He meant, tomorrow a judge will give me control of your finances, your home, your autonomy, and you will sit there confused and diminished while I explain that this is for your own good. I sipped the tea. I said, "Thank you, Richard." I set the mug down on the nightstand next to my reading glasses. They were in their case, lenses clean, ready for the morning. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to Richard breathe and ran through the evidence in my mind the way I'd run through audit files the night before testimony 100 times in my career. Account by account, document by document, lie by lie. At 5 in the morning, I got up, showered, dressed in a navy blue suit I'd bought specifically for this day, put on my reading glasses, and drove to the Henrico County Circuit Court. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Courtrooms always are. Fluorescent light, wood paneling, the faint chemical smell of recently cleaned carpet. Richard was already there with his attorney, a man named Lawrence Kemp, who wore a suit that cost more than my first car. Richard looked calm, confident. He was wearing the charcoal blazer I'd given him for his 50th birthday. He smiled at me from across the aisle, the smile of a man who believes he has already won. Sloane was in the gallery, third row, hands in her lap, looking smaller than 26. Richard's brother Craig sat 2 seats away. Peter Ashford was not there. He would later claim he had a scheduling conflict, but I think he knew. I think some part of Peter Ashford had always known. The hearing began with Richard's attorney presenting the conservatorship petition. Lawrence Kemp was good at his job. He laid out the narrative Richard had spent months constructing. A devoted husband concerned about his wife's declining cognitive function. A psychological evaluation confirming impairment. A physician's letter corroborating. A history of erratic behavior, the limp characterized as progressive deterioration, the shaking hands cited as neurological symptom, my mother's death offered as a traumatic trigger. Kemp's voice was steady and compassionate. He sounded like a man describing a tragedy, not engineering one. Then Elaine stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She said, "Your Honor, the respondent wishes to present evidence that the petition before this court is based entirely on fabricated documentation, and further, that the petitioner is the subject of an active IRS investigation for federal fraud." Lawrence Kemp was on his feet before she finished. Objection, relevance. The judge, a woman named Honorable Karen Liu, looked at Kemp over her glasses the way I imagine I looked at Dr. Voss during the intervention. She said, "I'll determine relevance. Continue, Ms. Cho." The courtroom air changed. I felt it against the back of my neck, that shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when a room full of people collectively holds its breath. The bailiff near the side door straightened. The court reporter's fingers paused for half a second above the keys, then resumed. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum at a different pitch, as though the building itself understood that the proceeding had just turned. Elaine entered the IRS whistleblower confirmation into evidence, the case number, the date of submission, 7 months before Richard filed the conservatorship petition. The scope, systematic fraud across managed client accounts. Lawrence Kemp objected again. Judge Liu admitted the document. Richard's expression didn't change, but his posture did. His shoulders pulled inward by a 1/4 inch. I knew that 1/4 inch. I'd been watching that man's body for 27 years. That 1/4 inch was fear. I watched his hands. They were flat on the defense table, fingers spread, the way you press your hands against a surface when the floor is moving and you need to believe it isn't. His wedding ring caught the fluorescent light. Gold. 14 karat. I'd picked it out at a jeweler on Carey Street in 1997. I'd had it engraved on the inside. The engraving said, "Always." I wondered, sitting there, whether he'd ever taken it off when he was with Diane, or whether he wore it like another piece of the costume. Elaine then called me to present the parallel audit. I stood. My left ankle registered the familiar half-second delay as I stepped into the aisle. I walked to the front of the courtroom with the flash drive Elaine's paralegal had loaded onto the court's projection system. The walk was 12 steps. I counted every one of them. I felt the grain of the courtroom carpet through the soles of my shoes, that low-pile institutional weave that gives just slightly under your weight. I put on my reading glasses, the tortoiseshell frames, the same frames I'd worn to read every fraudulent document Richard had ever produced. The same frames I'd worn at my kitchen table while I followed his money through 4 states and a dozen shell companies. The same frames, Dr. Voss said made her realize I was the auditor and she was the ledger that didn't balance. I presented the audit account by account. The projection screen glowed against the wood-paneled wall, columns of numbers rendered in the flat blue light of the court's display system. I showed the management fee structure Richard's firm disclosed to clients. Then I showed the actual fees charged. Then I showed the difference. Then I showed where the difference went. For each account, I named the client. I stated their age. I stated the amount overcharged. Dorothy Kendall, 74, retired schoolteacher, overcharged $22,400 over 19 months. Harold Ostrowski, 81, retired postal worker, overcharged $18,600. Margaret Chen, 69, widowed, overcharged $31,200. Walter and June Perkins, both 77, retired together from the same school district, overcharged $26,900. Robert Avery, 83, Korean War veteran on a fixed pension, overcharged $14,200. I named 14 clients. I stated 14 amounts. With each name, I let a beat of silence hold the room. Not for drama, because these were real people, real savings, real trust. The total, $2.3 million. I showed the Shell LLCs. I showed the property purchases. Charlottesville, $380,000. Wilmington, $295,000. Savannah, $310,000. Nashville, $420,000. I showed the forged performance reports that concealed the skimming. I showed the unauthorized fund transfers. Every number, every date, every signature. Richard's signature. On every one of them. The court reporter's keys clattered in a rhythm I recognized. It was the rhythm of someone transcribing faster than they expected to. Fingers chasing the volume of evidence pouring into the record. Judge Liu was taking her own notes. Her pen moved in short, precise strokes across a yellow legal pad. She underlined something twice. Richard's face was a study in collapse. Not sudden, not dramatic, but geological, the slow subsidence of a structure whose foundations have been removed. His jaw tightened. The muscle at the hinge of his mandible pulsed once, twice, 3 times. His eyes moved from the screen to me, to Lawrence Kemp, to the screen again. I could see the whites of his eyes from where I stood. The color had drained from his face in a gradient, from the temples first, then the cheeks, last the lips. He looked like a man watching his own house burn from across the street, understanding that everything inside is already gone and the fire trucks are just there to keep the neighboring homes from catching. Lawrence Kemp was writing furiously on a legal pad. He was not writing strategy. He was writing distance. He was preparing to be a former attorney for this client. I could tell because his handwriting had changed. When Kemp was strategizing during the petition presentation, his pen moved in smooth, confident strokes. Now the pen moved in short jabs, the physical motion of a man composing exit language in his head. Then Elaine addressed the psychological evaluation. She called Dr. Patricia Voss. Dr. Voss entered the courtroom through the rear doors. The gallery's heads turned in unison, a collective rotation that made the wooden pews creak softly. She walked with a deliberate stride, her black suit pressed, her posture the posture of someone who has decided to do a thing she cannot undo and has made peace with the cost. She was sworn in. She stated her name, her license number, her credentials. Then she stated in clear and steady language that Richard Reed had hired her to produce a fabricated psychological evaluation of his wife. She stated that Richard had provided pre-written intake questions, pre-written symptom descriptions, and a pre-written conclusion recommending involuntary psychiatric hold. She stated that she had accepted an $8,000 retainer. She stated that upon meeting Norma Reed in person, she recognized that the evaluation bore no relationship to the woman sitting in front of her. She surrendered every document. She surrendered the emails. She surrendered the payment records. She opened the manila folder and laid each page flat on the witness stand ledge, one by one, the way you deal cards when the game is over and it's time to show your hand. She said, "I am not proud of what I agreed to do. I am here because what he asked me to fabricate would have destroyed a competent woman's autonomy, and I cannot be part of that." Richard's right hand moved to his tie. He adjusted the knot. It didn't need adjusting. I had seen that gesture 1,000 times across 1,000 dinners and 1,000 mornings. It was the gesture he made when he was cornered and trying to appear composed. The tie was the navy silk I'd bought him at Nordstrom 4 Christmases ago. He was being dismantled in a suit his wife had dressed him in. Sloane made a sound from the gallery. Not a word. A sound. The sound a person makes when the story they've been living inside reveals itself as fiction. It came from low in her throat, a small, involuntary expulsion of air that carried 26 years of trust behind it. The wooden pew creaked as her body shifted. Craig, 2 seats away, turned his head toward her and then turned it back. He did not reach for her. He didn't know how. I did not turn around. I couldn't. If I had looked at my daughter in that moment, I would have seen the exact expression I had worn sitting in Richard's car in our driveway, reading messages from Diane. The face of someone whose world has just been rearranged at the molecular level. And if I had seen that face on my child, I would not have been able to continue. So I looked at the judge. I looked at my notes. I looked at the screen. I did not turn around. Elaine then presented the forged physician letter. She showed the original prescription pad from Dr. Alan Mercer's office, obtained through subpoena, the pad's serial number visible in the upper right corner. She showed the signature comparison, placing the authentic prescription signature beside the forged letter signature on a split screen. The differences were obvious once they were side by side. The loop of the M in Mercer was rounder on the authentic signature, tighter and more careful on the forgery, the way a hand writes when it is copying rather than signing. She showed that Norma Reed had no patient record at Dr. Mercer's practice, no file, no intake form, no insurance billing, nothing. She showed that Richard Reed had visited Dr. Mercer for a blood pressure check 4 months before the letter was dated, and that Richard had been left alone in the examination room for 11 minutes while the doctor was called away for a phone consultation, according to the office's own scheduling log. 11 minutes. That was enough time to take a prescription pad from the counter, fold it into a jacket pocket, and wait. The forgery was amateurish once you knew where to look, but no one had been looking. That was the whole point. No one looks at a husband's concern and sees a cage until the person in the cage starts auditing. Then Elaine played the recordings, 2 statements from Richard, back to back. The first, a voicemail to Sloane from March. His voice warm, paternal, concerned. "Your mother is the most important person in my life. I just want to protect her." The courtroom heard him say it. The speakers on the court's audio system were mounted near the ceiling, and Richard's voice came down from above, as though the room itself were channeling his performance. Every person in that gallery heard the sincerity in his tone. It was convincing. Even I, even sitting there knowing every word was calculated, felt a muscle in my chest tighten at the sound of it. The the residual reflex of a woman who had loved that voice for 27 years and whose body had not yet fully unlearned the response. Then the second, a text message to Diane from the same evening, read aloud by Elaine. Her voice was flat, deliberate, stripped of all inflection, letting the words carry their own weight. Once the conservatorship goes through, she can't touch anything. The house, the accounts, the firm. It's all ours by June. The silence in that courtroom was the loudest thing I have ever heard. 17 seconds. I know because the court reporter's timestamp captured the gap between Elaine's last word and Judge Liu's next instruction. 17 seconds where no one spoke, no one moved, no one breathed audibly. It was the sound of every lie Richard had ever told arriving at the same address at the same time. It was the sound of a 27-year performance ending. The fluorescent tubes above us emitted a faint, steady buzz that I had not noticed until that silence made it audible. The bailiff shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. A pen rolled off someone's table in the gallery and hit the carpet with a dull tap. These were the only sounds in the room while the truth settled like dust after a demolition. Richard tried to speak. He pushed back from the table and opened his mouth. I saw his tongue move behind his teeth. I saw the beginning of a word form, a syllable that might have been she, or this, or wait. Lawrence Kemp put his hand on Richard's forearm. Not gently. Kemp gripped Richard's arm and held him in the chair. His fingers pressed into the charcoal wool of Richard's blazer, the fabric bunching under the pressure. Because Lawrence Kemp, whatever else he was a man who understood that anything his client said in this moment would become evidence. Richard closed his mouth. His eyes were wet. Not from grief. From the recognition that he was sitting in a room where every person now knew exactly who he was, and there was no version of the story left that could save him. His hands, still flat on the table, had gone white at the knuckles. The wedding ring I'd picked out on Carey Street in 1997 pressed into the flesh of his finger. He looked at me. For the first time in the entire proceeding, he looked directly at me. I held his gaze. I did not blink. I did not look away. I let him see exactly what was behind my glasses. Not rage, not satisfaction. Clarity. The same clarity I bring to every audit. The cold, complete, unwavering clarity of a woman who has read every number and knows exactly what they add up to. Judge Liu removed her glasses. She set them on the bench. She placed them with both hands, aligning them parallel to the edge, the way you set something aside when you need your full, unfiltered vision. She looked at Richard for a long moment. Her eyes moved across his face the way mine move across a balance sheet, reading each line, checking each total. Then she looked at me. That's when I knew she believed me. Not because she said so, because of the glasses, the careful way she placed them down. She denied the conservatorship petition. She stated for the record that the petition appeared to be based on fraudulent documentation. She referred the matter to the Commonwealth's attorney and stated that the IRS investigation evidence would be preserved as part of the court record. She said, "Mrs. Reed, this court finds no basis for any restriction on your autonomy. You are free to go." Her voice was even, but there was a note in the final sentence. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition one professional extends to another when the work has been thorough and the evidence is clean. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a small sound that seemed enormous in the residual silence. I unplugged the flash drive from the court system. It was warm from the projector's heat. I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling its weight, which was almost nothing, which was also everything. I put it in my jacket pocket. I put my reading glasses back in their case. I heard the soft click of the case closing, the same click I'd heard 1,000 times at my desk at the firm after finishing a deposition review. A small sound, an ordinary sound, the sound of work completed, and I walked out of that courtroom on my own 2 feet, limp and all, past Richard, who did not look up, past Lawrence Kemp, who was already closing his briefcase, past Craig, who stared at the floor, past Sloane, whose face I could feel without turning, the heat of her gaze on the side of my neck as I passed. I did not stop. I did not speak. The courtroom door was heavy oak with a brass push plate worn smooth by years of hands. I pushed it open and stepped into the hallway, where the air was cooler and smelled of nothing but the building's ventilation system, pushing recycled air through overhead ducts. I walked to my car in the parking garage, sat behind the wheel, put my hands at 10 and 2, and breathed. Just breathed. The concrete ceiling of the garage was stained with watermarks in shapes that looked like nothing. The car smelled like the coffee I'd spilled that morning driving in, a brown stain on the passenger seat I hadn't had time to clean. I breathed and I looked at my hands on the wheel, and they were steady. For the first time in months, they were completely steady. If you're still listening, if this story is sitting heavy in your chest right now, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for the next person who tells a story like this and needs to know someone heard it. And if you know what it feels like to smile at someone who's dismantling your life while they kiss your forehead, drop a comment. Because you are not the crazy one. You never were. The collapse happened faster than I expected. The IRS investigation, the one Richard didn't know existed until the moment Elaine entered the whistleblower confirmation into evidence, had already resulted in asset freezes across every account he managed. His firm's compliance officer, a woman named Sandra Welch, was in her office when the court's referral arrived. She terminated Richard that afternoon. Not suspended. Terminated. The termination letter was 3 paragraphs long. Sandra told me later that she'd written it in 8 minutes, the fastest she'd ever drafted a separation document in 17 years of compliance work. His access cards were deactivated by 4:15. His client files were seized by 4:30. His desk was cleared by security while he was still sitting in the courthouse parking lot trying to call Diane. She didn't answer. He called 4 times. I know this because Diane's phone records were later entered into the federal case file. Diane Holiday. She was 38, a former real estate agent who'd transitioned into property management. She'd met Richard at a conference in Charlotte 18 months ago, the kind of conference that actually existed, and she'd believed what he told her, that he was separated, that the divorce was imminent, that the properties were investments in their shared future. When investigators from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division contacted her about the Charlottesville condo and the funds that purchased it, she did what any person does when they realize they're standing in the blast radius of someone else's fraud. She talked. She provided a full statement in 6 hours of recorded interviews across 2 days. She provided texts, emails, financial records. She provided the name of every property, every LLC, every account she had access to. She provided the dates of every trip they'd taken together and the credit card statements showing how they'd been paid for. She did not do this out of conscience. She did it because her attorney told her it was the only way to avoid being charged as an accomplice. Richard moved into a motel in Mechanicsville that same week. The Econo Lodge on Mechanicsville Turnpike. Room 117, a ground floor unit at the back of the parking lot with a window that faced the dumpster enclosure. I know this because Sloane told me, in a phone call, that was nothing like the scripted cognitive assessments of the previous months. She called on a Sunday, the way she used to call before Richard turned her into an instrument of his narrative. She was crying, not the careful, performative tears from the intervention. Real tears. The kind that come with snot and stuttering and the inability to finish a sentence. She said, "Mom, I didn't know. I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She tried to say something else, but the words dissolved into a breath that shuddered in and out 3 times before she could speak again. I waited. I held the phone and listened to my daughter breathe the way I'd listened to her breathe as an infant in her crib. back when the sound of her breathing was the most important sound in the world. I wanted to say more. I wanted to say that I forgave her. But forgiveness wasn't what I felt yet. What I felt was something slower and more honest than forgiveness. I felt the beginning of the possibility that forgiveness might come, eventually, on its own schedule. Not mine. The legal machinery engaged. Federal fraud charges for the client account manipulation, 18 counts, 1 for each month of documented skimming plus 1 for conspiracy. State forgery charges for the quitclaim deed and the physician's letter. A bar referral for Gerald Tate, the Norfolk attorney who notarized the fraudulent quitclaim deed. Gerald Tate's notary commission was suspended within 2 weeks. His law firm issued a statement calling the matter a clerical oversight, which is what law firms call fraud when it happens inside their own offices. The conservatorship petition, already denied, became Exhibit A in the emerging pattern of a man who used legal instruments the way some people use weapons, not to protect, but to control. The quitclaim deed was reversed. My name was restored to the Henrico County house, the house I'd lived in for 23 years, the house Richard tried to steal from me using his college roommate's notary stamp and a signature I never made. I stood in the doorway of that house the evening the deed was corrected and put my hand on the doorframe. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. I could feel the faint ridges of the grain under my fingertips, the texture of white oak that had been painted and repainted over 2 decades, each layer adding its own thin geography. I pressed my palm flat against it and felt, for the first time in months, that the ground beneath me was mine. The screened porch to my left held 2 Adirondack chairs I'd bought at a nursery on Staples Mill Road 8 years ago. They were weathered to a soft gray. No one had sat in them all summer. I walked over and sat down in the one on the left, the one that faced the yard. The screen mesh filtered the late light into a grid of tiny amber squares on the porch floor. I sat there until the squares faded and the light was gone. The key object. The reading glasses. My tortoiseshell frames. They sat on the kitchen counter that evening in their case. I picked them up and held them to the light. The lenses were scratched in the way that years of use scratches lenses, tiny marks from 1,000 documents, 1,000 spreadsheets, 1,000 lies that passed through these lenses and were caught. A hairline scratch near the left temple where I'd set them down too hard on a courtroom table during a deposition in 2020. A smudge near the bridge from where I'd pushed them up my nose that morning before walking into Judge Liu's courtroom. They were just glasses. They were also the only weapon I ever needed. I cleaned them with the cloth I keep in the case, the microfiber square that came with the frames when I bought them at the optometrist on Patterson Avenue, a square so soft it felt like cleaning something precious. I put them back and left them there, lenses clean, ready. Dr. Voss testified before the state licensing board 2 months after the hearing. She surrendered her records voluntarily. She disclosed the retainer, the fabricated evaluation, the communications with Richard. The board opened an investigation into her practice. She could have lost her license. Instead, the board issued a formal reprimand and required 2 years of supervised practice, citing her voluntary disclosure and cooperation as mitigating factors. She called me after the ruling. Her voice was thinner than I remembered it from the courtroom. She said, "I don't expect you to forgive me." I said, "I don't expect me to either. But I'm glad you showed up at my door." She was quiet for a moment. I could hear traffic through her phone, the distant sound of someone living in a city and standing near a window. She said, "You looked at me over those glasses and I knew I was the number that didn't add up." I almost laughed. Almost. The laugh formed somewhere behind my sternum and stopped. It wasn't time for laughter yet, but it was closer than it had been. Marguerite came over the following weekend. We sat on the back porch with a bottle of wine neither of us was particularly interested in drinking. The bottle was a Côte de Rhone she'd picked up at the Total Wine on Broad Street, and it sat between us on the small wooden table, its label peeling slightly at the corner from the condensation. We didn't talk about the case. We talked about her daughter's soccer tournament. We talked about a restaurant that opened on Broad Street. We talked about nothing, the way you talk about nothing when the thing you've been through together is too big to discuss and too present to ignore. The evening was warm for October. Crickets had started in the yard, that rhythmic pulse that sounds like the earth breathing. Eventually, she said, "You did it, Norma." I said, "We did it." She shook her head. "No, you did it. I just reminded you not to blow it up early." That was true. That was exactly what she'd done, and it was enough. Sometimes the Allies' greatest gift is the word, "not yet." 6 months passed. The seasons turned. Richmond settled from the blazing heat of late summer into the stripped clarity of winter, the trees along Monument Avenue going bare and skeletal against gray skies, and then into a spring that smelled like wet earth and dogwood. I drove to work each morning along the same route I'd driven for 22 years, and the city looked different. Not because it had changed, because I was seeing it without the film of a life built on someone else's lies. The James River glinted under the morning light near the Huguenot Bridge. The brick facades of Carytown caught the early sun in shades of rust and amber. I noticed these things. I hadn't noticed them in years. Richard's federal fraud trial was scheduled for the fall. His assets were frozen. The 4 properties purchased with skimmed client funds were in the process of being seized. 14 clients had filed civil suits. Dorothy Kendall, the 74-year-old retired schoolteacher, was the lead plaintiff. Her attorney told mine that Dorothy's only comment when she learned the scope of Richard's fraud was, "I trusted him with my husband's pension. My husband is dead, and this man used his money to buy a condo for his girlfriend." I will never forget that sentence. I will never stop being angry about it. Did you know that elder financial exploitation affects approximately 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 60? That number shows up in federal studies, in advocacy reports, in the kind of data I encounter routinely in my work. And according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, only an estimated 1 in 44 cases of elder financial exploitation is ever reported. 1 in 44. Richard's clients were in that invisible majority until I opened his books. Their money was disappearing in 12 basis point increments, amounts so small they were designed to be invisible, designed to exploit the trust that elderly clients place in the person managing their retirement. I think about those numbers when I think about what I did. I didn't just save myself. I saved 14 families who would have been bled dry by a man they called by his first name. 6 months after the hearing, I sat on my back porch. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that used to feel like absence and now felt like space. The Adirondack chair held my weight the way it always had, the wood giving slightly, the armrests smooth under my palms. The yard was green, not manicured, not perfect. I hadn't mowed in 10 days and the grass had gone slightly wild near the fence line. It didn't bother me. Wild was fine. My phone rang. The screen said, "Sloan." I looked at her name for a long time. The letters glowed white against the dark screen. 5 letters. The name I'd chosen from a baby book in 1998, circled in pencil, with Richard's handwriting beside it saying, "Yes." There was a period, not so long ago, when every call from my daughter carried the hidden architecture of an assessment, when her voice was a vehicle for questions someone else had written. That period was over. Sloan and I had spoken several times since the hearing, careful conversations, honest ones. She was trying to understand what her father had done, not just to me, but through her, using her love as a tool. That understanding was arriving slowly, the way understanding does when the person you trusted most turns out to be the person who used you most. I did not answer the phone. Not from anger, not from punishment. I set it face down on the armrest of the porch chair and picked up my coffee. It was still warm. The ceramic mug was the blue one I'd kept from a set of 4, the last survivor of a collection that had lost its members one by one to tile floors and careless mornings over 20 years. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, bright red against the gray, weathered wood. It stayed for a moment, turned its head, the black mask around its beak sharp as a brush stroke, and flew. I watched it go. A single red arc against the pale sky, then nothing. And I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could measure. Not happiness, not relief. Calm. The calm of a woman who chose herself and found it was enough. My reading glasses were inside on the kitchen counter, in their case, lenses clean. Ready for whatever I choose to read next. I used to believe that loyalty meant carrying weight no one asked you to examine. I was wrong. Loyalty without truth is just endurance, and endurance without awareness is how good people get buried alive. I also learned this. The same skills that make you competent in your work can save your life outside of it, but only if you're willing to turn those skills on the person you most want to trust. The hardest audit I ever conducted wasn't for a client. It was at my own kitchen table, wearing my own glasses, reading my own husband's lies in his own handwriting. If someone who says they love you is also the person explaining why you can't be trusted with your own life, that's not protection. That's a cage. And if you're sitting in that cage right now, wondering if you're the crazy one, you're not. I promise you, you're not. The shaking hands, the sleepless nights, the fog you can't explain, those aren't symptoms of your decline. They're symptoms of someone else's construction. And the moment you stop believing their story about you and start reading the actual numbers, the walls come down. That's the story. One pair of reading glasses, one flash drive full of lies, and one kitchen table where a woman stopped being a wife and became an auditor. If any part of this landed for you, if you've ever had to smile at someone who is quietly demolishing your life, or if you've ever discovered that the person protecting you was the one you needed protection from, tell me in the comments. When did you first realize the person helping you was the one holding you down? Subscribe if these stories matter to you. I'll be here